Thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, truly. Truly, thank you. It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you to the Interfaith Center for Spiritual Growth, to Annie, to Randall, to Delith, to all of you. Thank you so, so much. I felt when I walked in here today like I'm home. You know, when you're running for president, you are, for people who believe in many of the things that we believe in here, you find yourself feeling like you're in kind of alien territory. People living and forces active from a space of consciousness that we sort of like to avoid in our lives. But when I'm out talking to people, I realize that there's such profound decency and goodness in the American people. It just needs to be harnessed for political purposes at this time. When I am in a room like this, however, like I said, I feel, I'm home. I'm home, and when Annie was speaking just now, language that feels safe to her. There is language that I can say here without being, having it projected onto me that I'm an idiot, unsophisticated, and I just don't understand woo-woo kooky stuff. You know, there are people in this world, and they have a lot of power, who would claim that we're very naive to think that love could rule the world. And what I think is that they're so naive to think that this species will stay on this planet for another 100 years if we don't at least try. And I'm also aware when they make their projections of suspicion onto anyone coming from a more religious or spiritual perspective when it comes to political issues, that the entire trajectory of social justice movements in this country are redolent with religious and spiritual forces. Among white Americans, the abolitionist movement in this country emerged from the early evangelicals in New Hampshire. Among the women who were leaders of the women's suffragist movement, many of them were religious Quakers, and the entire women's suffragist movement came from that Quaker context of the inner light that made us all equal before God. And let us not forget that Martin Luther King was a Baptist preacher. So this idea of separating religious and spiritual perspective from politics, this is an aberrational modern concoction that has very little to do with the history of our country. Now, we do have in this country separation of church and state, and that is one of the most enlightened aspects of our Constitution. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it means. It has a double role, the separation of church and state. First of all, it means that the U.S. Congress will never have a minister or a rabbi or a priest or imam or ayatollah or anyone like that walking into the halls of Congress and saying, you can pass this law, but you cannot pass that one. That will not happen here. The governmental functioning will always be protected from interference by religious authorities. That's great. It also means, equally as important, that at a church like this, or at a synagogue, or at an AA meeting, or at a young atheist meeting for that matter, there will not be policemen coming in and saying, break it up, because this isn't on the official list. So this idea that people can worship however they wish, or if they wish, by the way, as I said, it's also protection for those who don't intend to worship. That's an extraordinary aspect of our Constitution. But our founders were not seeking to suppress the religious conversation. They were seeking to protect the religious conversation. JFK said we cannot afford to be materially rich but spiritually poor. And I understand, particularly because I come from a religious minority as a Jew, I do understand that our language when we're talking about political things needs to be kept secular in order to protect the emotional, psychological, intellectual safety of all Americans. But that doesn't mean that we're to leave these principles out of our analysis. That doesn't mean we're to leave these principles out of our beliefs about political matters. And so what has happened in the United States, and what you see here in a room like this, everybody in this room understands that there are certain principles that we must try to live by in order for our lives to work. If you're only thinking about yourself, if you're not even trying to be kind or good or compassionate or generous, if you're making it all about you and not about other people, your life does not work. things begin to fall apart.
There's a spider right there. Can I kill it?
That spider, don't kill it. Take it outside. Get outside. Take it outside. Don't kill it. Don't kill it.
I'm sure everybody's going to Google now the meaning of a spider at a religious center. What are the metaphysics meaning of that? So we know that there are certain principles of goodness and integrity that we should live by. The issue here, and why I'm running for president, is that I believe that those principles of goodness and integrity and character should apply as much to our collective behavior as to our individual behavior. It really is not enough for your individual life to work if your country's falling apart. And I have also realized, and I'm sure you all do, that all that a nation is a collection of individuals. So the same psychological principles, moral principles, spiritual principles that prevail within the life of an individual prevail within the life of a nation. And ever since I wrote my first book on politics in 1998, that book came out, that was my inquiry, was how do spiritual principles apply to the life of our nation? Now, one of the things that we realize in the physical body is that there's a natural intelligence to the physical body, and every cell is guided by a kind of natural intelligence, and it is assigned to where it is meant to go. It is meant to go to the pancreas, or it is meant to go to the lungs, or it is meant to go to the eyes, or it is meant to go to the heart, meant to go to the skin. And through this natural intelligence, every cell is guided not only to that organ, but then to collaborate with other cells. The highest functioning of the cell is to collaborate with the others in order to serve the healthy functioning of the organ and the whole of which they're a part. But every once in a while, cells go insane, and they disconnect from their natural intelligence, and basically they go off to do their own thing. And they say, I don't want to live my life in service to the life of the pancreas. I don't want to live my life only thinking about the lungs or the body. I want to go do off my own thing. And then those cells find other cells that are similarly malformed and non-collaborative, who have forgotten their larger function, and then they form groups, and those groups are tumors. Groups of cells that leech on the life of the organ, leech on the life and suck the life force out of the organ and the body. That, of course, is called cancer. That is a malignancy, and that is exactly what has happened to the human race. We have been infected by a malignant thought, and that malignant thought in consciousness is no different than the malignant functioning of a cancer cell, and that is, it's all about me. It's all about me. It's all about me. I'm not here to collaborate. It's not about service to something bigger than myself. It's all about me. And I can find people who are just as narcissistic and selfish as me, and we'll form a group. We can even support each other. And this forms, it leaches from the lifeblood of the organ of that society and of the body itself. And then that mentality takes form. It takes political form. It takes social form. And it might even be something that is acknowledged as permissible by the society. And that is exactly what corporate greed is. Corporate greed is a cancer on our society. Corporate greed is when entire forces say the money made by a few is more important than the safety, health, and well-being of the many. It's what happens when we say that economic principles devoid of any ethical or moral consideration is more important than democracy, is more important than humanitarian concerns. And it becomes a huge force, and it is backed by so much money, and it is backed by so much power, and it is backed at this point, and this is what is particularly dangerous, by so much government enabling, because that money is giving so much money to the government itself, that we find out at a certain point, oh my God, we're a diseased system. We have got to do something about this. You don't just, sometimes people say, well, what you focus on expands. No, some things expand because you don't focus on them. You don't have a doctor saying, well, you have a stage 2 cancer, but let's just not think about it. Let's just not think about it and it'll go away. And then you go whatever direction you want, whether it has to do with more traditional modes of healing or whether it has to do with non-traditional modes of healing, but you don't ignore the cancer. You know, and that's what I think a shadow side, or I would say not so much a shadow side as an actual misunderstanding of spiritual principle. When people say it's only an illusion, let's not look at it. Excuse me, that is not transcendence. That's denial. Posturing as transcendence. Right? In A Course in Miracles, it talks about positive denial. You don't deny that there are children hungry in the richest country in the world. You don't deny that 1 in 4 Americans live with medical debt. You don't deny that over 1 million people in the United States are rationing their insulin, none of which is happening in any other advanced democracy. You don't deny that half of our seniors are living on less than $25,000 a year. You don't deny that people are having to work 3 jobs to put food on the table. You don't deny any of that. The Course in Miracles says you practice positive denial. Negative denial is, oh, let's just not look at that now. Positive denial is where you say to each one of those things, oh, I see you, and I deny your power over me. I deny your power over my children. I deny your power over our democracy. I deny your power over our earth. And you don't try to negotiate with a cancer cell. That's not what you do. And so we are living at a time of great challenge, and that is the song that we just sang. These are hard times. Now, I want to talk a little bit about something I felt when I walked into this room. I'm 71 years old, and I see quite a few people in this room who I know are of my generation. I want to tell you something that happened to me when I lived in Michigan. I did live here for 8 years. I had a pulpit at the Unity Church in Warren, Michigan. I raised my daughter here. And when I left Michigan and went back out onto the lecture circuit, I was speaking a lot of different places. I called my best friend Richard and I said, Richard, my audience is now older. And he said, Marianne, it's the same people. It's the same people. So when I look at this room, I know who we are. I always say to young people, if you really want to know who people are, ask yourself who they were when they were in 1970 or in the 1960s or in the 1970s, right? Whoever thought, by the way, we'd ever be nostalgic for the 1970s, but, right? And the reason I mention this is because I lecture a lot at colleges and universities. I certainly hope I'll be back in Ann Arbor next month, speak at University of Michigan and so forth. There is a resonance, kind of like a first and a third on a piano, between those of us who were young during the countercultural revolution of the 60s and 70s and those who are young today. There is a similar rambunctiousness. There is a very important intergenerational connection to be made there, because I think all of us have a very healthy, all-American, rambunctious sense within ourselves in the face of certain overreach by ridiculously, absurdly immoral corporate forces today. Oh, hell no. Hell no. Hell no. So let's talk about what is happening in the United States today. There is no spiritual or religious tradition that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. So let's just be very clear about that. If you're talking about a spirituality that somehow justifies looking away from human suffering or other species suffering or the suffering of the earth itself, please call it a lot of things, but let's not call it spiritual, okay? Because where there's not love, there is not, that's what spirituality is. It's the path of the heart. And love cannot just be the modern ways that people say, this is a big one that I love. Have you noticed how many times people will say, oh, I support you in doing that? And it means nothing. They plan to do nothing to help, but I really support you in doing that. Yeah. Have you had that? A lot of like, oh, I really support you. I think it's great what you're doing. I really support you. Really? Because we could use a volunteer here. Right? There's a lot of that. We appropriate the language of love. Love is not passive. Love is fierce. Love is active. Love is something you do. Love is not enough if we say, oh, I'm so sorry that that child is hungry. No. It doesn't mean anything if you just say you're really sorry that that child is hungry. It does mean something if you feed the child. And when push comes to shove, I think it matters whether or not we vote for the people who would feed those children. And we live at a time when the way the U.S. government functions, it's sort of baked into the cake that in the final analysis, we will not feed those children if it in any way impinges upon the corporate bottom line, short-term profit maximization for huge corporate entities, which at this point have so turned our government into a system of legalized bribery that you better believe that tax cuts for the very, very rich, demonization of humans, policy of unions, not humans, unions, sort of the same thing. Constant policy after policy, making it easier for those who already have capital to accumulate more, and harder for everyone else to even make it at all. As long as that is the case, it is baked into the cake that our own children are collateral damage. Our own children will go hungry if that's what has to happen in order for the richest among us to make more. This needs to stop now. Now, we sang today about how these are hard times. I hear a lot of people who say they're very, very sad about what happened with, the election of Bernie Sanders, the last election cycle and the election cycle before that. I know myself, I've been in the belly of that beast last time, I'm in the belly of the beast this time. I know nobody has to convince me, nobody has to inform me that the system is corrupt, nobody has to inform me how mean it is, nobody has to inform me how the machine has it all locked up, nobody has to inform me, nobody has to inform me about any of that, but you know what I say? Oh, boo-hoo, toughen up, buttercups. Because I'll tell you something, this idea that we were made such time as this, I think history really helps us right now. I was talking before, about the fact that among white people, much of the abolitionist movement emerged from the white evangelicals in New Hampshire. You think the abolitionist movement didn't have tough days? You think that they went after the abolition of slavery expecting it to work? Do you think that they weren't told, don't even think about it? You think they weren't told and shown? Do you think that there wasn't plenty of proof that huge industrial powers, huge monetary power, huge governmental powers, and in time huge military powers were arrayed against the idea of the eradication of slavery? Did they stop? No, they did not stop, because they were made for such times as those. And when the women in the women's suffragist movement were told that the institutional suppression of women, this is just the way it is. Women aren't going to get the right to vote. You're not going to have the right to do anything about it if your husband comes home drunk and beats you and beats the children. What, you want to be able to take the kids with you when you walk away? What are you thinking? You want to be able to vote in order to try to change that? Don't even think about it. And yet they persevered because they were born for such times as these. And when in the Gilded Age, the overreach of capital was so great that the worker, the average worker, had to work hours and hours and hours and hours and hours with no benefits, with no help, hardly able to feed their family, children in factories, going through terrible, terrible situations just in order to have some bread. And when the forces of government and the forces of industry were arrayed not only against people trying to establish labor unions, but in some cases killing them, just as they imprisoned women suffragists, just as they came at the early abolitionists. But did those early labor organizers stop? No, because they were made for such times as those. And when segregation had its grip and institutional forms of oppression against black people in the American South and elsewhere, do you think that Martin Luther King and the early civil rights workers, do you think they thought that they could succeed? You think that they weren't disappointed? They had to face dogs, they had to face hoses, they had to face constant humiliation, they had to face constant lynching. Do you think they thought, well, it should work? No, they didn't work. They didn't care. They knew they would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. They did it because it was the right thing to do. They were born for such times as those. My message to you today is this: it's our turn now. Because corporate greed has formed a matrix of oppression in this country. from universal, the only reason we don't have universal health care like they have in every other advanced democracy, the only reason you have over 1 million people rationing their insulin, 68,000 people dying every year from lack of health care, millions of people whose insurance will cover the trip to the doctor, but sorry, it won't cover the medicine that the doctor prescribes to you. It won't cover the operation that the doctor says you need to have. The fact that we have millions of people, 85 million uninsured or underinsured. Do you think that that has to do with the fact that it's just complicated? No, it has to do with the fact that it is corrupt. It is the insurance companies and it is the pharmaceutical companies. The fact that you have carcinogens in your food. Have you ever read about the what's in a ketchup bottle in the United States versus a ketchup bottle in Canada? You want to read up on that sometime. Why do we have 46% of our water supply that is filled with PFAS, these forever chemicals that do not break down? Why do we have chemicals in pesticides that we know harm a child's brain, if not for big ag, big food, big chem? Why do we have little children praying every morning? You know, everybody says, oh, people are afraid to send their kids to school. People are afraid. People are praying every day when they drop their children off at school. Let me tell you else who's praying. The children themselves. You think we have a mental health crisis now? What's going to happen 10 years from now when you have a generation coming into maturity who grew up in elementary school and junior high school and high school praying every day, dear God, please don't let me get shot in algebra class today. And let me tell you something. The majority of Americans, Republicans as well as Democrats, want universal health care. The majority of Americans, Republicans as well as Democrats, want tuition-free college and tech school, which we had in this country until the 1970s. The majority of Americans, Republicans and Democrats and gun owners want universal background checks and common sense gun safety law. This is not a problem with the American people. This is not a problem with the left. It's not a problem with the right. Eisenhower said the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. This is a problem with a corrupt and sclerotic political system, which at this point has been turned into a system of legalized bribery and is totally owned by corporate America. It's time for the people to step in. No matter who you have, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, you have them lining up with big oil. This is not the time to be ramping up fossil fuel extraction. How many more storms? How many more floods? How many more wildfires are we going to have to see? And we have, even with the Democratic president, who calls himself a climate president because of investments in green energy. Well, all those green energy investments are completely nullified by the fact that he has given more oil permits than even Trump did, and by the Willow Project on the North Slopes of Alaska. So one party doesn't even pretend, and the other one is gotten really good at pretending. And that's the corporatists within both parties. Now, I'm running as a Democrat because, you know, when the corporatist Democrats look at progressives like myself and say we're trying to hijack the party, excuse me, no, they hijack the party. We are Eleanor and Franklin. They are the DuPonts and the Whitneys and the Morgan, right? So that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is that whether we're Republican or whether we're Democrat, whether we're on the left or on the right, whether we're liberal, progressive, or conservative, people are figuring it out. The people to your right aren't the problem. The people to your left aren't the problem. The people up there are the problem. The issue, the axis in America today is not left versus right. The axis in America today is the powerful versus the powerless, those who have capital and ways to easily accumulate more versus those who are struggling to make it. And let's be very clear, in America today, the majority of people are struggling to make it. The majority of Americans say that they live with chronic economic stress. The majority of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. The majority of Americans cannot absorb a $1,000 unexpected expenditure. Now, I want to say to those of you who are younger in the audience, and there are a few of you, I'm going to talk to you about a faraway land, and you're probably going to think I'm talking about a fairy tale or something, but there are a lot of people in this room who would say, no, it's actually what she's saying is true. I was there. Are you ready for this? It was called the 1970s. And I'd like to describe to you something about the 1970s. Are you ready for this? The average worker had decent benefits. The average worker could afford a home. The average worker could afford a car. The average worker could afford a yearly vacation. The average couple could afford for one parent to stay home if they wanted. And the average worker could afford to send their kids to college. So how did it happen that today it is so hard? How did it happen that today, if you're in 20% of the highest earners of the United States, it's a very decent economy, and we're to be grateful for that. However, for 80% of Americans, life is filled with constant economic despair. And we're just trying to invisibilize it. Let me tell you something else. They're trying to invisibilize the candidate who wants to discuss it. And so, we cannot as spiritual beings say, oh, I'm too spiritual to think about those things. That's not spirituality. Spirituality, if anybody here in this room, if God forbid, somebody fell over in this room and they couldn't breathe, or they were having a heart attack, something was a problem, we wouldn't say, oh, we're talking about spiritual things, so let's just forget that. It's all illusion anyway. No, Annie, Randall, Dallas would say, okay, is there a doctor in the room? Please, everyone else leave. Is there a doctor or nurse in the room? Somebody would get on the phone right away, call 911. You don't let somebody suffer and not do something about it. So if we would help one person, why would we not help millions? Why would we not help millions? And so there's a fierce aspect to the divine. There's a fierce aspect to the divine. Any of us who have children or take care of children know that there's a time, usually in the teenage years, usually having something to do with drugs, alcohol, or sex. And you find this fierce aspect rising up from deep within you. And you find yourself echoing your own parents and saying, that will not happen in this house. Do you understand me? That will not happen in this house. And you're actually laughing inside because you really don't know what you would do or say if they challenged you at that moment. But you're so fierce in that moment that, oh, mama's mad. We have to become that way about this country. Hungry children, that will not happen in this house. The highest poverty rate of any advanced democracy, no, that will not happen in this house. People dying from lack of health care, no, that will not happen in this house. The idea that we are in a country where our Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal, actually diminishing the rights rather than expanding the rights of equality. The fact that we in a country are dedicated, theoretically, to a Declaration of Independence, which says that God gave, and I remind everyone here that the Declaration of Independence is a spiritual and moral document as much as it is a political one. God created all men equal. God gave inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. How do you say to a child who has to walk through a domestic war zone every morning to get to school? And even when that child gets to school, that child may or may not be attending a school that has the resources to teach them to read by the age of 8. And if they cannot learn to read by the age of 8, 10 at the highest, then their chances of high school graduation are decreased and their chances of incarceration are greater. Oh, where is their right to pursue happiness? Children are the greatest collateral damage of corporate greed. They have they can't work, they have no financial leverage. They can't vote, so they have no constituency. And we are living at a time right now, talking about labor laws, labor unions. There were people who struggled to have child labor laws in this country and in both Arkansas and Iowa at this time. And I am heartbroken to say both states with female governors, they are gutting child labor laws.
Shame on them.
Now, this isn't going to stop until we say, no, this has to stop. And it can't be out of anger. Moral outrage is not born of anger. When Gandhi said, we must be the change, he was saying that because he was saying, otherwise things will not change. Everything we do is infused with the consciousness with which we do it. If we seek to change all this out of anger, anger becomes like the white sugar of political activism. You have a lot of adrenaline and then you crash. It is not a surprise that people in rooms like that, we don't even want that. We know it's low-level vibration. I'm not saying let's sink to low-level vibration. I'm saying let's take the world into high-level vibration. But when you're in high-level vibration, where love is the response to everything, guess what? Sometimes love says no. When your child walks into the kitchen, a little baby with scissors, you say yes. You know, I was taught that when my daughter was a little baby, say yes, make it yes whenever you can. Honey, we do it this way. But sometimes if that child is carrying a razor blade, sometimes you just got to say no. And sometimes the divine within us, there is a divine feminine, yes, and there's also a divine masculine. There are times in life where, just like the abolitionists, just like the early labor organizers, just like the women suffragists, and just like those in the civil rights movement, said, as Rosa Parks said, I'm tired. I asked Mrs. Parks, I met her when I was here in Detroit. She used to come over to Renaissance Unity, and I said a question to her that I'm sure so many people had said to her. What made you do it, Rosa? What gave you the strength? What gave you the motivation to do it? And she gave me the same answer she probably gave so many other people, but which has stayed with me, and I think about it all the time. She said, I was tired. In AA, they say you grow sick and tired of being sick and tired. Yeah. And you get into the solution. And it's time for us to get into the solution. And for those of us who emerge from places like this, who come to places like this, we are taught certain things. And we are taught the principles that not only make a life work, but also the principles that repair a life that has been broken. And it is time for us to do that, just as we've seen those principles at work in our own lives. I've said for years, in rooms like this, we should be the last people sitting out the great social, economic, and political questions of our day. We should be the ones contributing our voice, because if you have an idea what heals one life, you're the one with a clue what would heal the country and what would heal the world. That's why you pay reparations, for instance. You pay reparations simply because you know for an individual and therefore for a nation, you simply can't have the future you want until you clean up the past. There are certain principles that simply apply to politics and spirituality as much as to anything else. So it's time for all of us to contribute. It's time for all of us to stand up more than we have ever stood up before. And if we try to do that, I know that it's very depressing. I know that it's hard. Like I said, I'm talking to you from the belly of the beast. But I do believe it's time for us to toughen up. And when Clarissa Pinkola Estes, on whose words that song was based, says, take heart, for we were born for such times as these. We have everything we need. I am so aware in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Afghanistan, I couldn't do what I'm doing right now. If I stood up to even think about wearing what I want, about criticizing my own government, I am so aware. I am so aware of my being hauled out of here, being tortured, being raped, being possibly killed. It's time for us to remember that not only is this about our rights, it's also about our responsibilities. Every generation is the keeper of something sacred. The very idea that you could have a country, the very ideal where all are supposed to be equal, all are supposed to be able to soar, all are supposed to do whatever they want to do, be wherever they want to be, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. We are to be the keepers of that story. And we grew up at a time when we thought, well, we don't have to pay too much attention. All we have to do is, vote every 2 years, and whatever political party I believe in, they'll basically take care of it. They didn't take care of it, okay? We are not a religious, spiritual dispensation that says to a woman who's been beaten by her husband, go back to him, honey. We would say, no, you do not go back to that guy. There's a certain point where you realize that's a codependent, dysfunctional relationship, and you need to break it now. And we need to break our dysfunctional, codependent relationship with a group of people, some of whom are very nice individuals. This is not about nice people. Not every rich person is a greedy bastard, and not every person who disagrees with us in government is not a nice person. This is not about nice people versus not nice people. That's not what this is about. Everyone is blessed, and we are here to bless. Martin Luther King, as a matter of fact, said, you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. We need to find that sweet spot in our heart where we bless not only those who agree with us, but also those who disagree. But I'll tell you something, at a certain point, if you are violating a boundary, just like you violate my personal boundary, you're violating our political boundary if you allow that child to eat something that could give them cancer or asthma. If you allow that child to go to school in a zone where you know there are unhealthy factors that need not exist and only exist because of your whoredom to corporate donors, it's time for us to say, no, that won't be happening any longer. That will not be happening any longer. But they will resist, they do resist, and I can tell you from personal experience, they can be vicious. And they go way, way down, and they go way, way low to keep anyone out of the conversation that they don't want to be there because they feel that it undercuts their bottom line of their donors and so forth and so forth. The abolitionists were not willing to be silent, and the women suffragists were not willing to be silent, and the early labor organizers, of which my father was one, were not willing to be silent, and the civil rights workers were not willing to be silent. It's time for us to be unwilling to be silent. It is time for us to realize that we have a sacred responsibility to the ideal of a country in which everyone should at least have a shot. Everyone should at least have a shot. So it's time for everybody to come out of their silos right now. Doesn't matter if you're black, white, brown, Jew, Christian, Hindu, straight, gay, what your gender of many apparently, transgender, right, left, enough. Those individual identities do matter, but there's a larger identity right now which is of overriding importance. In alchemy, there's a term called separatio. Yes, you separate out all the different individual pieces, but only so that they can join at a higher level. So at this point, whether you're Black American, white American, Jewish American, gay American, whatever, let's remember that we're Americans. And when we talk about the functioning of the body, let's remember that the body has an immune system. And when something is wrong within the body, the immune system sets in. And society has an immune system as well. In the society, each of us are cells in the society. Each of us are assigned to the organ where we can best serve. Some of us are assigned to the arts. Some of us are assigned to business. Some of us are assigned to environmental activism. Some of us are assigned to labor. Some of us are assigned to wherever we are assigned. But right now, we're all assigned to the immune system because we are wounded and we need a season of repair. What are you supposed to do? None of my business. Not my business to tell you what to do any more than it's your business to tell me what to do. Just as every cell is guided by a natural intelligence, each and every one of us are guided by that small, still voice within. When Gandhi said, when he was asked, who is the leader of the Indian independence movement? His answer was the small, still voice within. But I'll tell you something, if you're a Michigander, how you answer has a lot of significance and a lot of power. The early primary system in the United States is pretty profound. There are people in a few states who will get to, with their votes, dominate, choose what conversation dominates the process. Michigan has always been important in the general, but this year it will be important in the primary season in a whole new way. It's not for me to control who you vote for. You will listen to other candidates. It's your responsibility to yourself and to your country. All that I can control is that you have before you an option of a real change in this country, a season of repair, a season of serious and fundamental economic reform for a Department of Peace, for a Department of Children and Youth, for an end to the drug war, for an economic Bill of Rights. All I'm asking that you do is that you listen. Listen with your heart. Listen with an expanded mind. Listen with the heart that beats in a place like this. Because from that place of depth, no matter who you vote for, we'll find our way. And we will, in our time, do that which we were born to do. It's our turn, and we were born for these times. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hello?
Now we're going to have people ask questions or make comments, whatever you want. And I think Annie's saying she's going to get that mic together. You want me to help? It's important for us to realize how many homeless people in America today are actually working full-time. It's important for us to realize how many people were holding on until one rent check that they couldn't make. It's important for us to realize how many people couldn't make the rent check because they had to face the harrowing choice between their insulin or their rent. And they thought, well, at least if I'm alive, I can do more for my kids from a car than if I'm dead. We have to realize how many Americans are living with their children in cars. And what happens is that they're afraid, well, if I'm living in the car with my child and my child mentions it at school, they're going to come take my child away from me. Child Protective Services will come take my child away. So my only choice while I'm working full-time living in my car is to homeschool my child. So I'll take my child home to homeschool because I'm afraid of the school authorities turning us in for the crime of being homeless, right? And so now I have to use the internet to homeschool my child, but I'm living in my car, so I will go to McDonald's to use the Wi-Fi to try to do what I need to do to homeschool my child. Plus, we have huge real estate forces such as BlackRock and Vanguard that are now commodifying housing. So that for our young people, for instance, it's not really a lack of housing. By the way, I want to give kudos. There is something going on in Detroit right now, the Tiny Houses Project. Oh, it's so beautiful. It's so inspiring. And I want to say something about that. You know, we are today considering some heart-rending problems that America has. But speaking of those tiny houses, I want to mention something. America has no dearth of solutions about anything we're talking about. Our food, healing, energy, economics, work, anything. We have the people and the best practices and the expertise that know what to do. Are you ready? We all get that. The disconnect is between those with solutions and those with power. Those with solutions don't have the power, and too many times those with the power don't really want to give too much credence to those with solutions because those solutions would not give us short-term profits for huge corporate entities that are those donors. All it would give us is, I don't know, maybe we could save our democracy and save our planet and save our species. In fact, when I get a visual of what it would be if I were president of the United States, because I meet these problem solvers everywhere I go, this is a visual that I have in my mind. I'm in the Oval Office, and I open all the doors, and I open all the windows, and I say to all the problem solvers out there, come on in, we have it for 4 years. That's what needs to happen. That's what needs to happen. There are people who have the right idea. It's not like Americans don't know what to do, including about homeless, including the fact that those real estate entities should not be able to buy up whole neighborhoods. We have young people in this country today. By the way, I have to say, I want all of us to think about the time when you were in your 20s, okay? Got it? You remember the time when you were in your 20s? Could you have handled tens of thousands of dollars of debt? And really, what would it have done to your personality? And then we wonder where the mental health crisis comes from. The same system that goes on and on, talking about, yes, we must address the mental health crisis, will not address how much the economic injustice which is infused in our society today is causing so much of it. I remember when I lived in Detroit, and a U.S. senator said, oh, do you have any ideas about what we should do about the mental health crisis? And you know what I said to that senator? Yeah, I do. Stop driving everybody crazy. Didn't like that answer. So it's not like we don't know what to do. It's that we need to harness the political will to make sure that it happens. Okay, who's next? I am Ms. Williamson, my name is Matthew. I am a Marine Corps veteran. Thank you for your service. I have a couple of questions for you, along with free health care, which is what we want, single-payer Medicare for all, which is part of my economic Bill of Rights, free tuition, which we had in this country until the 1970s, universal, University of Florida had a system, Texas had a system, and California had a system. Can you please make all illegal drugs federally legal? Actually, I think we should do that. I think that we should end the drug war. And I want to talk about that for just a moment, if I might, because I think it's important, and it's something our generation can relate to. When I was a young woman, and I had lived with a heroin addict for 2 years, thinking he was going to NA meetings every day, silly me, but I learned a lot, as you can imagine. When I was a young woman, and I think this is true probably for all of us, recovery was certainly an issue in a subculture in the United States. Today, it is an ubiquitous problem. It is an ubiquitous problem. In 1971, when Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs, John Ehrlichman, who was one of his aides who went to prison, when he got back to prison, got out of prison, he had gone to prison for Watergate, he spilled the beans on everything. And one of the things he said was, of course, he knew that drugs were not public enemy number one at that time. And of course, we did it mainly to harm the black communities. Okay? We have spent over $1 trillion on the drug war. We have done as much, if not more, to hurt the problem than to heal the problem. We spend over $100 billion a year on the war on drugs. That money would be much better spent. A fraction of that money could be spent on a world-class network of recovery and harm reduction services. We need to change our attitude towards drugs in this country from a criminal issue to a health issue. And that is what they do in a country like Portugal. Also, it is fundamental to dismantling the prison industrial complex. When I was in prison, when I was in college, we had 300,000 people incarcerated in the United States. Today, there are 2.3 million, and almost half of those in the federal prison system are there for nonviolent drug offenses. You don't criminalize someone who is addicted. You help someone who is addicted. Also, in addition to that, this would make a big difference at the southern border, because the majority of people who are immigrating here, trying to escape horrors, violent horrors in their countries, there are two main things that are involved here that Americans need to look at. Number one, how much American foreign policy has contributed to the destabilization of many Latin American economies over the last few years, but also the fact that our drug war has actually exacerbated the power of the drug cartels. You legalize those drugs. This is the one area where I say, hey, let the private sector handle it. Let the private sector handle it. And then I'll tell you something else. Once you do that, we can get to the real serious problem that we do need to put our resources behind, and that is the fentanyl crisis. So that's the answer to that one, sir. Can you also defund the police, take away their guns? Defund the police, reallocate resources so that we learn. You know, when it comes to foreign as well as domestic issues, you know, Martin Luther King said there are two kinds of peace, positive peace and negative peace. Negative peace is where there's no outright violence, but there's an underlying tension and anxiety. Positive peace is the presence of brotherhood and justice. That is why I want a Department of Peace. I want a Department of Peace because there are 4 factors of peace building. Peace building is a real thing. It's a real set of expert skills. These 4 factors, when present in any community, whether it's a corner of a U.S. city or another corner of the world, statistically mean there will be a higher level of peace and a lower incidence of violence. These are the factors, none of which will surprise you. Number 1, greater economic opportunities for women. Number 2, greater educational opportunities for children. Number 3, a reduction of violence against women. And number 4, an amelioration of unnecessary human despair. What we do now, we need to look at peace and war the way we look now at the health of the body. You have to proactively create health, not just fight disease. And we must proactively create peace. I want to create a society in which we are not just looking to police and bombs and prison, to allopathically suppress and eradicate symptoms of an unhealthy society that we did not proactively tend to through issues of justice and brotherhood. So that is what I want. And then I want a reallocation of resources in the terms of social workers, in terms of restorative justice practitioners, in terms of people who know how to do nonviolent communication skills, et cetera. I also want to look at how police are trained in this country compared to other countries where the education is far more extensive and where the concentration on non-lethal force is much greater, and we need in this country a serious legislation regarding police reform. The fact that Black Lives Matter was the largest protest movement in the history of the United States, and it did not lead to one legislative change, says something very, very bad about us as a society. Okay. Make smoking tobacco legal in all public places. No. Take away daylight savings time, wouldn't be in the power of the presidency. Remove leap year, not in the power of the presidency. What is your outlook on abortion? I believe that abortion is a moral issue, but I believe that it is an issue of private, not public morality. I trust the moral decision-making of the American woman, and I don't think the government has any right to tell the American woman what her moral decision should be. And if you can you bring the death penalty back to every state in the United States of America? No, but if I can, I will eradicate it in whatever state I possibly can.
Today, a lot of gay Americans have found the courage to hang the gay flag on their home, but oftentimes you won't see the American flag on there too. Would you speak to that?
We recently had something very terrible, of course, happen in California. The woman in Reno, actually it was in Reno, and she had the gay pride flag outside her business, and she was shot and killed in response for that. In terms of the American flag, so I think anybody should fly the gay pride flag who wants to. I think that, you know, when we were talking earlier today about the idea that it's not about, you know, I feel in my own life, if there's one piece of advice I have finally learned is the biggest piece of advice I can give to myself, which 90% of the time is what I need to hear, it's this: oh, Marianne, get over yourself. This is not about you, right? And I think we all need to see that about our country. It's not always about you. It's about the idea that anybody can do what they want to do. So for that reason, of course, people should fly the pride flag whenever they want. Now, when you say people are not also flying the American flag, what were you meaning specifically by that?
It seems as though that flag has now taken a symbol that it didn't back in the 70s.
You know, my father was a big lefty, and we had an American flag in our front yard. But what's happened, the American left on the last few decades has sort of acted we're too cool to be patriotic. We're too cool to act patriotic. Well, guess what? The ersatz version of it was just left on the floor and somebody else picked it up. And we did the same thing with morality. Oh, we're too cool to talk about patriotism. We're too cool to talk about morality. Guess what? Somebody else came in with the ersatz version. So I think we should all be proud of the American flag, and the American flag needs us at this time. Oh, one question from the overflow room, too, we were told. Hi, overflow room. Thank you, thank you. I mentioned earlier that I want a Department of Children and Youth. It's almost quaint now to ask, what are we going to do about the education system? Because the problem is so much larger than just their education. We have children who are traumatized by preschool. I have heard elementary school principals tell me they have elementary school students on suicide watch. When this woman was talking just now about students with special needs, one of the reasons we're losing teachers throughout America is not only because of the danger in the situation, but because for many students with special needs, many students with behavioral problems, the teachers say, this is not what I was trained to do. I was trained to teach. Instead, you put 50 kids in my classroom, and I'm supposed to, control the crowd? and deal with children with disabilities and children with special needs, and by the way, then it's my fault if that kid doesn't know how to read at the end of the year? We're blaming the teachers for this, but then we also have to look at the food that that child has been eating. We also have to look at the fact that there was no free preschool. This is an example. We need to open our eyes at what is happening in this country. I read an article that said 1/4 of the girls in Chicago public schools would be diagnosed today with post-traumatic stress disorder as bad as that of a returning veteran from, let's say, Afghanistan or Iraq. But we have to consider this. Their PTSD is actually not post-traumatic stress. It is present traumatic stress that is triggered every single day. When that child has to walk through a domestic war zone in order to get to school, when that child hasn't eaten, when that child is growing up in a violent home and so much of that violence and those adverse childhood experiences are absolutely contributed to by poverty, we can't just talk about education. We have to talk about the crisis of humanity. The crisis of humanity. So the reason I want Department of Children and Youth is because we know so much now about early childhood. We know more about early childhood and the brain of the really little ones than we even knew 10 years ago. You know, I have a granddaughter now, and I'm watching. My daughter sends me pictures and videos every day. When you watch babies, and you watch what they're picking it all up in those very, very early months and years. We have to take care of our children better before they even reach kindergarten. And we have to take such a holistic view of all this. That's why I'm saying amelioration of stress is not enough. That's what the political status quo. We'd like to help you out here. We'd like to help you out here. But not so much that it actually impinges upon the profit-making margins of the very forces that will make the return of your pain inevitable. For that matter, you know, I remember in 2020, I was one of the first people saying we need trauma-informed education. Now everybody says we need I'm not saying I started that conversation, please don't get me wrong. I'm just saying within the political conversation of candidates, okay? Now everybody's talking about trauma-informed education. But what comes up for me at this point is, why is childhood such a trauma for so many American children? This is not a matter of just saying trauma-informed education. It's facing the fact that too many children need trauma-informed education. We're all living our lives. Oh, it's about trauma, it's about trauma, it's about trauma. Yeah, we need to ask ourselves, why is life so traumatic for so many people in the richest country in the world? And like I said, rooms like this is where we know in our personal lives, in our personal relationships, in recovery, therapy, religion, we go deep. We answer big questions. You know, this is my experience of Americans, okay? You could take any two people in this room, okay, who don't know each other and say, okay, we're going to go out to lunch later. My experience of Americans is within half an hour, you'd be having a real conversation of some depth and reality and authenticity about what's really going on in your life. Do you have kids? Are you married? Has anybody been ill? You just go there. We are as deep and real as people in any other country. We're as decent as people in any other country. We're not better, but we're not worse, okay? But in our public conversations, in our political conversations, we have been trained to dumb it down. We have been trained to repeat narratives that we got from some political or media factor. We've been trained to think like sixth graders. We've been trained to limit our political imaginations. We need to get as real, authentic, as honest, and willing to look in the mirror. Anybody from a spiritual perspective like is discussed here knows sometimes you have to look in the mirror. America needs to look in the mirror. And I want to be a president who helps us compassionately do that. Okay, overflow room.
Hi, Marianne. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Mahi. I'm a student at the University of Michigan. I had a question for you about forgiveness.
Forgiveness is 90% of everything personally, and in my opinion, 90% of everything politically. This is the deal. None of us have a monopoly on truth. We all, on both the left and the right, need to get off our high horses. We all need to purify our own hearts. You know, there is a space where breakthroughs occur. Call them miracles, call them breakthroughs. They happen politically as well as personally. That's what abolition was. It was a political miracle, and so forth. But we have to find that sweet spot, that place where Rumi described, out beyond all ideas of good and bad, right and wrong, there is a field. I'll meet you there. None of us, you know, one of the reasons just drives me nuts about the political parties, neither one of the major political parties have anything to be proud of right now. Neither one of them have anything to be self-congratulatory about right now. But you know what? We all have to take responsibility as well. It should never have gotten this bad. And any of us who thought, well, I'll show up to vote every 2 years or every 4 years, when corporate lobbyists are in those legislators' offices every hour of every day, it simply wasn't enough. As a matter of fact, if we were to have the kind of fundamental change that we need in this country, there has to be a breakthrough in all of our hearts. We have to start making politics simply a layer of a well-lived, meaningful life, but not the kind of toxic politics that none of us want to have anything to do with. A new recreated politics that comes from our heart. If the possibility ever opens, if I become the President of the United States, I've thought about what would your inauguration speech be, and it has been very clear to me this would be the main element. In order to go forward, let us forgive one another. Let us forgive one another. Nobody has a monopoly on truth. Nobody's gotten it completely right, and like a tiny, tiny fraction of Americans have gotten it completely wrong. We need to practice some radical goodwill towards those who agree with us and those who do not agree with us. Like I said here today, this is not bad people versus good people. That's not what's going on here. Not every rich person is a greedy bastard. Not every poor person is holy and pure. None of that. None of that. This is about systems that are unjust, not about people. We are all fragile, we are all broken, and we all want to love and be loved. Does that make sense? And I also want to say this. Far more people love in this country than hate. You know, you look at the media sometimes today and just think, you know, the haters are out there. I mean, I've just been, you know, it's just chilling for me. As a Jew particularly, to see the Nazis that are gathering every week in Florida on those highway overpasses, giving their Nazi salutes with the swastika flags. This is like serious stuff. And there is something I think Jews feel, I think black people feel, this fierce, you did it to my grandparents and you're not going to do it to my kids. About white supremacy, about whatever it is, Nazis, whatever. I understand all that. But I also understand that the vast majority of people in this country are decent, good people. Now, we need to remember this. However, conviction is a force multiplier. If you have 10 people who are convicted behind hate and have proven, as some of them do in America today, that they will do whatever it takes 24/7 to effectuate their worldview, and then you have 100 people who are really nice and loving and come to places like this or any other secular or religious place and really are loving and feel like I really want justice and I really want love. And listen, I'm all for that. And listen, I have Tuesdays and Thursdays I could give you between 3 and 4. Then the haters win. We have to become as convicted behind justice, economic justice, racial justice, environmental justice. We have to become as convicted behind justice and love and mercy and forgiveness as some people today are demonstrably convicted behind hatred and racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia and authoritarianism and Nazism and Proud Boys and genuine fascist tendencies. The spiritual life is not about negative denial, it's about positive denial. It's about God bless you all, and you cannot have our country. Okay, anybody else? Okay, that gentleman there, this lady here, and that lady there, and I promise if you could go faster, you are going faster. I need to go faster. If there's anyone in this room who is in a field, an RN, having to do with a hospital, having to do with healing, having to do with health, having to do with mental health, and you feel that you might have part of a solution, an answer for this woman, would you please speak to her when we break today? Thank you. Thank you. Okay. The president does not have a magic wand. We don't want our president to have a magic wand. That's why you have three co-equal branches of government. Any president, no matter who, Joe Biden, George Bush, anybody, is hoping for a Congress or Senate that will align with their views. This was true of Roosevelt. This was true of any president. You have the Congress that you have, but the president still has a lot of executive power. The president still gets to appoint the people who are heading the agencies. The president still gets to appoint the people who have to do with things such as labor, such as support for labor, such as issues of children, such as being the commander-in-chief. You're going to have but Congress is the one that allocates the money. There is no doubt about it. So I do believe, first of all, I have to tell you, if this country gets into a place where you'd elect me president, I think you'd elect a lot hipper group of congresspeople and senators too. You know what I mean? I think there's a real good chance of that. I think a lot of people would say, no point in electing her if we're not going to try to elect some people who are going to align with her. Do you know what I'm saying? But that's true of any president. But you know what? I'll tell you something else. Roosevelt faced a lot of opposition. Who he called the economic royalists came at him vehemently. And they called him a socialist, and they called him a dictator, and they did all those things, which of course they would do to me. But you know what he did? You know how he responded? I welcome their hatred. Now, in my heart, I wouldn't be feeling really happy about that, but it would be my job as advocate for the American people to stand my ground, to hold the line, and if necessary, to welcome their hatred. I want to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart for giving me this opportunity to be with you. Thank you to the Interfaith Center for Spiritual Growth. Much love to you.